Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be my Q1 wrap-up. So we're going to be going over some goals, see how I'm tracking with some of the goals that I set for myself at the beginning of the year, see where I can maybe improve or do better, talk a little bit more about statistics and about some books that really stood out to me. So with that, let's get into the video. So for part of the video, I'm going to be referencing some of the stats that come up on Storygraph. For the rest of them, I'm going to be referencing my reading journal, which I've been really trying to stay on top of. Definitely failed to keep track of certain things in the journal, which we will talk a little bit more about later. But for the most part, I think I've done a pretty good job keeping up with it, given that it's my first year keeping a reading journal to track my reading. So yeah, I'm really happy about that. So, starting off right at the beginning with my 2023 reading goals. So starting off with my 2023 reading goals, I had a total of 8 goals at the beginning of this year. Let's go through them one by one and talk about how I'm doing. My first goal was to read a total of 80 books this year. I am tracking with that. At the end of March, I finished with a total of 44 books read, which is already more than half of my total reading goal for the year. So I have no hesitation that I'll meet that goal, and if anything, it makes me really excited because I won't feel like I need to rush at the end of the year to try to meet that goal, if that makes sense. So my next reading goal is to read through my book of the month backlog, which I have completely failed at. I don't think I've picked up a single book of the month book at all this year. It's something that I can definitely work on beginning this year. So I do have a spread of all of the book of the month picks that I have. I didn't renew this past month just because I haven't been reading them, and if I don't read them, then what's the point of getting them? It just didn't make sense for me to continue paying for the service if I'm not reading the selections that I'm getting from them, when I can easily go out and purchase a book that really calls to me. So I actually did cancel it at the end of March. We'll see how my reading with my book of the month picks go, and then I'll reevaluate at the end of the year or in a couple of months to see if it's a service that I still want to continue using. So it looks like I have about 24 unread book of the month picks from this year, last year, and 2021. And I definitely want to get that number down. So it's something that I'm going to prioritize a little bit more moving forward. So moving on to my next goal. Goal number 3 was to read down my TBR, which I have equally been massively failing on. I think from my own physical TBR, in the combined months of January, February, and March, I read a total of 4 books that I own. So 1 in January, 1 in February, and 2 in March. So I've read 4 books from my TBR these past few months. And I'm not mad about it because it means that I've been using my library a lot more, and I love to support my local library. I've also been reading a lot of advanced reader copies, so it's been a combination. So I'm not mad about it because I tend to look at my shelves as a book collection, as a library that I can read from whenever I want to, not as like an endless TBR that I need to get through. So I'm not mad about it. But I do want to read a little bit more of the books that I own, especially if I'm buying them when I'm really excited to read them. That's when I want to get to them potentially. Goal number 4 is write a review for every single book. So this year, I challenged myself to write a review for every single book that I read. It was something that I wasn't very good at keeping a track of in previous years. Like I would go on Goodreads or Storygraph and just give it a star rating, and then not write a review of how I felt about the book. And sometimes I go back and I wish I would have written how I felt at the time, because sometimes I just can't remember how I felt in a particular moment about a book. So this year I challenged myself to write a full review for every single book that I read on Goodreads or Storygraph, and I have been doing it. So I'm really proud of myself for keeping that up. If you don't follow me on Goodreads or Storygraph, my links are always down below. Although I guess a side goal that wasn't really official is to review every single book that I read in my reading wrap-ups every month. In the past, I was also really bad about doing a wrap-up, especially for months where I read tons of books and I forgot details of the books that I read at the beginning of the month. So moving forward, I want to do a mid-month check-in. That way, it doesn't feel overwhelming at the end of the month when I'm reviewing the total sum of books that I read. So actually, I think this video is going to come out before my March wrap up, so it will be coming, I promise. Goal number 5 is to read 12 nonfiction books, and I have to say that I've been doing a pretty awesome job with this goal as well. Out of the 12 nonfiction books that I wanted to read, I've already read 6. That's going to be Finding Me by Viola Davis, which I gave 5 stars to, Hysterical, which is a memoir, The 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls, which I gave 3 stars to, Letters to a Writer of Color, which I gave 5 stars to, Ace by Angela Chen, which I read this month, which I gave 5 stars to, and then Invisible Kingdom Reimagining Chronic Illness, which I gave 3.5 stars to. And I'm actually in the middle of another nonfiction book right now. So I feel really, really, really good about this. I've already read half of my goal, and I'll probably even read more than 20 nonfiction books by the end of the year. So that is awesome. So for this particular category, I would say that Finding Me by Viola Davis and Ace by Angela Chen were the two standouts for me. Very different reasons. Finding Me was just such a raw and vulnerable read and insight into Viola Davis's life. And I did listen to it on audiobook. She narrates it herself and she does a fantastic job, by the way. It was just such a well-written book, full of so much heart and emotion, and I love how real she was in it about her life, about the acting industry. It was just really, really, really good. And then Ace by Angela Chen was personally impactful for me because I'm finding ways to navigate my sexuality and learning more about my sexuality and what that means. And this book gave me a lot of tools and words in order to express my experience. And it also challenged me to be inquisitive with the things that we consider normal or standard. One particular thing that Angela Davis addresses out of the many things that she does, it's a very intersectional book, by the way, which I forgot to mention. But she talks about how kissing is sort of seen as the standard for a romantic relationship. There's actually a lot of cultures and countries where kissing is not the norm in the relationship, and that's seen as odd or somehow deficient. And it did make me think, like, why is that something that we expect? Like, if we go on a date and you don't get kissed by the end of the night, why do we think that that was a bad date? Why do we make assumptions that that person is not into us if we don't get that kiss? It made me reevaluate and think on a lot of different aspects of my life and the relationship that I'm currently on, right? If some of you are not aware, I am engaged. Ben and I have been together for 6 years already, 5 years. It's been quite a while. And we receive and give affection in completely different ways. So it's a lot more about communicating what we need and what our expectations are than to assume the intentions of each other. That has gone such a long way, I just have to say. Wow, okay. I I completely went off the rail there. Let's get back to the books. So yes, those two were the standouts for my nonfiction books. Goal number 6 is another goal where I've been massively failing at, and that is to read 12 classic books this year. So far, I've read one, which was Recitatif by Toni Morrison, and it was fantastic. It's technically a short story, but I'm counting it. It was so, 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 so good. It's the only it's the only classic on this list, but it's definitely a standout. I gave it 5 stars. In terms of classics, I don't have a particular genre in mind. I also don't want it to just be US centric classics. Like one book that I really hope to get to this year is Anna Karenina, which I don't know if it will happen because It's a long book, but another one that I really want to get to that is a Chinese classic is I have it right here. Is Journey to the West or Monkey King. This is a new translation and I love the cover. So this is another classic that I want to read. I don't have a list right now of every single classic I hope to get to this year because I know I'm going to deviate from that. I know myself and I'm not going to do that. But those two are definitely on the list and we'll see if it happens this year. My seventh goal for the year is to read 20 books by Black women, and I've been doing an okay job there. So as of March, I've read 7 books by Black women. We have Recitatif, My Sister the Serial Killer, Queenie, The Many Dates of Indigo, Jackal, Finding Me, and The House of Eve. So we do have quite a good mix there, I think, of genres and topics. Like we have a memoir, we have a short story, we have horror, historical fiction, romance, and that's what I'm hoping to do, right? My intention going into that challenge this year was to read a variety of different voices within the diaspora that are written by Black women. I don't just want to center one particular narrative from the Black community. I think that can be harmful at times if we just focus on one type of narrative. So I wanted to get a whole range of them, right? From a memoir, a coming of age story, something that focuses on happiness, a non-Western Black experience. So I think I've done a pretty good job so far, but there's always room for improvement, right? So as a side note, this is not an official challenge, but I have been keeping track of it, and that is the number of books by Latino, Latina, Latinx, and Latinate authors that I'm also reading. I am keeping track of it, but it's not an official challenge. I can't remember off the top of my head right now how many I've read. We'll go into it when we get into these stats. So that brings us to our 8th and final goal, and that is to read the backlist of loved authors. And I don't have a spread on here for that. So I actually don't know how well I'm doing with that goal, which is, a problem. So I'll definitely be creating a spread before I start reading for April. And we can talk a little bit more about that goal in Q2. I will say that I did read All the Dangerous Things by Stacy Willingham, and she is an author that I personally really enjoy. I really liked A Flicker in the Dark, and I loved All the Dangerous Things. So I would say she's one of my favorite thriller writers now. Um, and so that's one example, but I don't think I've been doing a really good job of reading the backlist of loved authors. So definitely something to keep in mind moving forward. So those were my reading goals. I do have a spread here of my yearly statistics, but before we go over those, I want to pull up my Storygraph and go over some of the statistics on there first. Here we go. So as I've already mentioned, this year I have a goal to read 80 books, and I've already read 44 books, which is 55% of that goal. In terms of mood and pace, it's pretty consistent with last year. So out of those 44 books that I've read, the top 5 moods are emotional, dark, tense, reflective, and mysterious. Yes, that sounds like me. I don't gravitate towards a lot of lighthearted or fluffy or humorous books. That's probably maybe a red flag for me that I like heart-punching books, like books that traumatize me a little bit. But that's a conversation for another day. Um, so in terms of pacing, 79% of the books that I read are medium paced, 7% of them are slow paced, and 14% of them are fast paced, which is not surprising to me at all. I prefer character driven over plot driven books, but once in a while, I could go for a plot driven book. Sometimes I need it, especially when I'm coming out of a reading slump. That's when I need plot driven books. They just suck me right in, I need that. In terms of page number, so 14% of the books that I read are over 500 pages, 36% of the books that I read are under 300 pages, and 50% of the books that I read are between 300 and 500 pages. which again, I think is pretty accurate for me. Yee! Okay, this is where I'm excited. 86% of the books that I read are fiction, and 14% of the books that I read are nonfiction. I'm very happy with that number because in previous years it's been like 1 or 2%. It was awful. So I'm really happy about this particular graph. Now, moving on to genre. This is where I feel like I have the most change from year to year and quarter to quarter because I'm a mood reader. And even though I wouldn't consider myself a seasonal reader, each month or every couple of months, I do feel like I'm in a mood to read something different, if that makes sense. And I never really know what I'm in the mood for until I find it. So I can't tell you that I gravitate towards fantasy books in October and to romances in the summer. Like, I can't tell you that. I can't think that far ahead. But in the moment, I'm like, yeah, I'm feeling some literary fiction, and then it lasts for months, and then it switches up again. And you never know what I'll be in the mood for next. So, in Q1, my top genre was literary fiction, with 10 books read that were literary fiction. Following that is horror, with 8 books read that were horror. Followed by that, we have 3 that are neck to neck. We have mystery, fantasy, and contemporary, each with 7 books read. And then we have thriller books with 6 books, which is different because I feel like usually my top 2 spots are fantasy thriller and then literary fiction third. So I'm shaking it up this year. Yeah, I like it. So in terms of most read authors, I'm a little bit ashamed right now because I have 2 white men right at the top. And this was something that I wanted to change from 2021 because I had my most read authors were white cis men. And I told myself that that wouldn't happen again. And here I am in Q1. So we have a 3-way tie between George R.R. Martin, David Wellington, and Abby Jimenez. So George R.R. Martin makes sense because I'm currently reading A Song of Ice and Fire. Just finished A Clash of Kings at the beginning of March, and I'm moving into A Storm of Swords. Now with David Wellington, so I read one of his books February, The Last Astronaut. I was craving space thrillers or space horror books, and I read that one and I quite enjoyed it. So he's coming out with a new book in April. It's going to be published April 4th. I don't know when this video is going up, so it might have been published already, but it's called Paradise 1. And I thought it was going to be a standalone. It's not a standalone. I don't know if it's a series. I don't know if it's a duology. I checked on Goodreads and it's not clear. So the book does end on a cliffhanger, so I know it's going to be at least 2 books. That's how this happened. Abby Jimenez. So I read A Part of Your World last month at the beginning of the month, and I loved it so much that I requested her newest book, Yours Truly, which will be published this month on April 11th. Loved it. It was so, 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 so good. So that is how that happened. I'm not too mad about it. I just really want to amp up my goal of reading more backlisted books by authors that I love in hopes of evening out my most read authors. I want more of a variety. Sweet. So in terms of rating, my average rating is 4.12 stars, which is kind of high for me, I would say. Although, again, I'm not mad about it because that means that I'm reading a majority of books that I am at least enjoying, right? Which is great. So I've had a total of 14 5-star reads in quarter 1. They're all really, really, really good. I don't even know if I can give you a standout right now. Well, let me go on a gut feeling. I would have to say it's All the Dangerous Things by Stacy Willingham or Liar, Dreamer, Thief by Maria Dong. The reason for that is because they were the books that surprised me the most. Like, I had a subtle expectation going into them, and they just completely wowed me. And I feel like that's the best feeling in the world, where you're already going into a book thinking you're going to like it, and then you end up loving it. So those 2 were standouts. Funnily enough, they're both thrillers, but they're very different thrillers. Liar, Dreamer, Thief has some like fantastical sort of incorporations where our main character goes into what she calls her kitchen door world, and she retreats into that when she is in a very perilous situation or she has a lot of anxiety. And so she sometimes doesn't know what's real and what's not. There's also this like element of a conspiracy. It's kind of off-putting at times because you're in her head the entire time and things are not really clicking until they do click, if that makes sense. And then All the Dangerous Things I really liked because we have women at the forefront that are flawed and with different views of motherhood. I really liked her commentary in this particular book about women, about motherhood, about expectations, and about the things that are not acceptable to talk about when people talk about motherhood. Like postpartum depression. Like that is a real thing that people go through and should be talked about. So I think those two are the standouts. So I did give 7 books 4.5 stars, 10 books 4 stars, 4 books 3.5 stars, and 6 books 3 stars. I also gave 1 book 2 stars, 1 book 1.5 stars, and I decided not to rate one particular book that I did finish, but just had a lot of trigger warnings for me, so I didn't feel like I could really give a rating to a book because the content was a particular trigger for me. So I didn't think that was fair, so I didn't rate it. Yeah, so those were my stats on Storygraph. I briefly want to talk about my stats in my journal. Any that we didn't cover, some of them we did. I didn't do the math. I didn't do the math. Give me 1 second. I'm going to add these up and then I'll come back and talk to you. I'm back after doing some math. So, jumping into the format of the books that I read. So, 22 books out of those 44 books read were consumed via audiobook, and 11 of them were consumed via ebook on my Kindle, which means I read 11 physical books, 4 of those which I owned, so 7 of those physical books were from the library. Now, in terms of where I get my books from, so 23 books out of the 44 were from the library. That's via audio and ebook. And then 17 of those books were advanced reader copies out of the 44 books, which I feel is a good combination, 23, 17, and then 4 books that I physically owned. Unfortunately, I reread 0 books in Q1. In general, I am not a really big rereader, but something that I do want to do is go back and reread some of my childhood favorites to see if they're still favorites. I feel like I had a very eccentric taste when I was younger. Like, one of my favorite books back then was The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, which I feel like that's not the case for a lot of young readers. Like, I don't know what compelled me to like that book so much. I just really liked his writing style. So I wonder if I would still feel the same way about it now. It could be a video idea for later on in the year. I read a total of 3 translated books in quarter 1, which is a lot lower than I want it to be. I'm a big translated fiction gal. This is actually my translated bookshelf, and I want to read a lot more from this particular shelf. Um, in terms of some of the things that I track, out of those 44 books, 34 of those books were written by women. 12 of the 44 books were written by Latinx authors. 8 of the 44 books were written by Black authors. And unfortunately, I haven't read any books by Indigenous authors this year. So it's something that will be a priority moving forward. And out of the 44 books that I read, 37 of them were new to me authors, which tracks because I'm not reading backlisted books from authors that I've already encountered or loved. So those were the stats that I keep a track of. I know one area that I do need to be more intentional about is reading, or at least tracking, because I am reading books by LGBTQIA plus authors. I'm just not keeping track of them, which is something that I do want to fix moving forward. Keeping track of them which will allow me to see if there's more movement that I can make on those fronts. So definitely something I want to incorporate and see how that goes in quarter two. So those were my stats for Q1. I'm very happy with my reading in quarter one. I did have a minor reading slump in March, which I hope will be corrected with tons of mood reading in April. I just want to read whatever my heart desires and not care about goals or statistics. I'm just gonna give that to myself for April, which means I'll probably read a lot of translated fiction, which is perfect. So yeah, we'll see how that goes. If you've made it this far, leave your most used emoji down below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye!